Hey everybody, welcome back to Hail State Debate. This is going to be our first of some new shorter videos covering debate skill sets. It's a little bit different than our usual videos, which come out every other month or every month addressing new topics. What we're going to do is we're going to take on skills like a rebuttal, cross-examination, looking at responding to certain types of arguments, making certain types of arguments, and kind of help you build up those skill sets and improve just generally as a debater. So if you find it helpful, maybe give us a like, maybe subscribe. If there's something you'd like to see us cover, some particular issue, drop us a note, drop us something in the comments, and we will be glad to see if we can put it on the agenda. But what we're going to be talking about today is probably the single most important and maybe one of the more challenging skills that new debaters have to master. And really in any form of debate, this is important, and that's flowing. So if you're brand new, flowing is just a very specialized form of note-taking that we use in almost every form of competitive debate, from college policy to high school Lincoln Douglas, IPDA debate, which is what we do at Mississippi State. And it's extremely important for keeping track of arguments in the round and sort of keep your arguments and responses flowing in the right direction, no pun intended. This video is mainly aimed at new debaters, so if you're brand new, don't worry. We're going to start at the very, very beginning and explain everything from start to finish, explain why we're doing what we're doing. And at the end of the day, hopefully you'll have a good basic grasp on how to get better at flowing, which will, I guarantee you, make you a better debater. So let's start with one preliminary question, which is, why is flowing so important? And the answer is you can sort of thank this guy. This is John Locke. He is a philosopher who's extremely important in, for example, Lincoln Douglas debate. He came up with, among many other things, an idea called the tabula rasa theory, which is the idea that we human beings come into the world as tabula rasa. That means blank slates. And while we're not going to talk about that political theory today, it has migrated into the world of competitive debate with the idea of tabula rasa judging. And tabula rasa judging just means, if you haven't heard of this before, that and it's a pretty common sense idea that judges ought to decide the round based on what the debaters actually say. In other words, what they actually hear in the round, as opposed to their own personal beliefs or prejudices. In other words, they should come in as sort of a blank slate. And one of the corollaries of that is the idea that if you don't respond effectively to your opponent's argument, the judge can't go in sort of and mentally refute it for you. They can't just dismiss that argument because they don't think it's very good, they don't think it's important. And this gives rise to what's called the dropped argument. The dropped argument being, if you don't respond, many judges will treat that as being sort of consenting to the argument or agreeing to the argument or conceding it. And you can see how, if that's the case, you could very quickly find yourself in a bad position if you're not keeping very careful track of the arguments that are going on in debate. And that's one of the key areas that led to flowing in debate as one of the skill sets all debaters have. So when we start talking about how to actually flow, there really are, in my view, sort of two separate skills that go on with flowing. The first one is actually learning to take notes on an individual case, like listening to another debater throw out hundreds or even thousands of words and boiling that down to a simple, succinct outline that puts the key ideas in your head without wasting a whole bunch of time trying to write everything down. Because the first lesson of flowing is you can't write everything down, and if you try, you're going to miss out on a bunch of important stuff. So the first skill is, how do we learn to take effective notes on the individual case? And then the second skill that we'll talk about later is, how do we flow that case across all the different speeches? In other words, how do we follow an argument from one speech to the response in the next speech and so on throughout the entire round to make sure that we have a good picture of what's going on in the debate? And so those are the two major areas we're going to cover. Before that, though, I want to cover just a few quick preliminary points. What are you actually going to be flowing on? What are you going to use? Well, if you're brand new, we generally use in debate, just sheets of paper and pens. Legal pads are very common. A lot of my teams use those. And typically, as you'll see in this diagram here, one of the marks of knowing that somebody is begun their journey as a debater is whether or not they turn the legal pad sideways. Now, not everybody flows with their sheet of paper turned sideways, but it is a pretty common thing just because of the way you need more space from left to right to kind of follow those arguments as they move throughout the round. So again, what works for you, and you can choose to use a different method. You don't have to turn it sideways, but many people find that turning the sheet of paper sideways is a good idea because it lets you have more space from left to right. Also, another tip is if you're going to use a legal pad, they come in two different varieties. One is the 11-inch variety, but they also have 14-inch varieties. And if you like, you might order a package of the longer ones to give you a little more space. I actually think that's a really good strategy to use. But you don't have to do it this way. Many debaters, for example, will use 2 sheets of paper, one for the affirmative and one for the negative. Just tear one sheet off and then use the pad for the other. In this particular video, we're going to focus on using one sheet of paper divided in half, but if you choose to use multiple sheets, all the same principles apply. It's just you're putting the affirmative on one sheet and the negative case on the other. So that works fine. And even some people use like pre-printed forms. These are common in some programs, and they can be great. Again, whatever works for you. But no matter what you're actually using to put your flow on, some basic principles apply. So let's talk about what those are, okay, just to get it sort of out there on the table for everybody. The first thing is, when we look at our sheet of paper in a flow, we have 2 basic things going on. The vertical axis up and down, we're going to follow the arguments made in each case. So we're basically going to start taking notes at the beginning of the case. We're going to put it in the top of the column. We're going to move from argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, in order, and basically keep more or less a sequential record of what is being said, right? And then we have 2 debaters, right? So we're going to divide the piece of paper in half, or potentially use 2 sheets of paper. So we're going to have, 2 horizontal rows, right? And then because we have, more than one speech in a debate, we're going to divide the page up into columns based on the number of speeches. So this example is a Lincoln-Douglas round. There are 5 speeches in a Lincoln-Douglas debate. So we're going to divide up into 5 columns, and we're going to put what's said in each speech into its appropriate column. And in this way, we can sort of keep things organized. So we have 2 rows for 2 debaters, 5 columns for 5 speeches, and basically, as you can see at the top, what we're going to be doing is sort of giving each argument its own kind of lane to follow it across. We're going to start by writing down what it is, then we're going to note what our response is, note what the response to the response is, and so on. And as you'll note here, I'm using different colors for the different sides. That's another technique we'll talk about later to kind of help things stay organized in your head. Now, notice that you can absolutely apply this to any form of debate. Obviously, this is an example of what a public forum debate flow might look like. There's 8 speeches as opposed to just the 5. So this can apply in any way you want, but the same basic principles are the ones we're going to use in every case. A few basic tips before we get started on the actual flowing part, which is, remember, whatever works for you works for you. We're going to give you some tips in a few minutes and some ideas, but again, things like abbreviations, things like how you physically lay out your flow, it's all adaptable. The whole point of a flow is to keep these arguments in your mind, to keep them in the front of your mind and organized so that you can get up there and you can say them out loud and make the judge understand them. So if something works for you, then it's a good technique. There's an old Chinese proverb that, if it doesn't matter if it's a red cat or a black cat or a white cat, if it catches mice, it's a good cat. And if your flowing technique helps you keep those arguments organized and get them out there, then it's a good flowing technique. Also, remember that good flowing is about making judgment calls about what matters. You can't flow everything. You can't write everything down. We're going to talk about the best ways to kind of pick and choose what belongs on the flow and to filter out some of the stuff that may not. And then finally, and this is true in everything in debate and everything in life, practice is going to make you better. This is something that you've taken notes in class, I'm sure, for a long time in your life. This is a different skill. And in particularly, transitioning what's on your flow to your mouth, to the judge's brain, is a unique skill that you have to work on. So just remember, practice is going to make you better. Practice flowing debates. Practice flowing your teammates. Watch debates on YouTube. Watch good debaters on YouTube. Watch fast debaters. Watch slow debaters. And do your best to try to flow them. It will make you better at flowing. It will make you a better debater. And so with that, we're going to jump into section 1 about flowing individual cases. Okay, so the first step in learning how to be a good note taker or a good flower in debate is learning how to actually take good notes and follow an individual case. So if you're brand new, you imagine yourself sitting there listening to a debate case, not necessarily a super fast debate or just a regular case, and you quickly realize that there is so much information coming through that there is no way that you can possibly write it all down. I mean, even if they're just going at a moderate speed. If you try to literally write it down word for word or almost word for word, you're going to miss a lot of stuff. If you randomly choose just a word here or there, you're also going to miss stuff. So it's very important to have some sort of logical set of priorities for what you actually want to put on your sheet of paper to follow throughout the round. And that's what we're going to talk about. So to do that, we are going to use my favorite example resolution that I use with novices. I've used it in another video already, and that is resolve Chick-fil-A is the best fast food restaurant. So if you're brand new and you're listening to your opponent, let's say this is maybe an in-class debate at school or something, and if you just sort of listen to what they said, they got up and did an affirmative speech, and you would sort of vaguely maybe remember what they said. You would kind of have these mental pictures in your head. Their first point was something about fries being good or something. Their second point is something about healthiness or something about that. And their last one had something to do with friendly service. And if you just sort of followed along in your head and you didn't take any notes at all, these mental images would probably be at most what you would have to go on in refuting the case. And that would obviously not be good if you wanted to try to win the round. So what most brand new debaters do is this. They're going to write down the basic arguments that are made in a little bit of shorthand. So you can see here, you've got number one, Chick-fil-A fries equals tastiest. We're already starting to see some shorthand, which is good and very common and flowing, whatever works for you. Something about Chick-fil-A being a healthier alternative, and something about friendly service, okay? Well, look, if this is all you do, it's certainly better than nothing, right? You're not going to forget what arguments were made, but you're also not going to have a lot of detail on what was actually said and what you need to respond to. And so this is what I'm going to label rookie mistake number one, which is only flowing the claims or the taglines. I can't tell you how many times after a first tournament of the year, brought in a bunch of novices, even novices who are starting for the first time in college who have not debated before. And I look at their flows and we sit down and talk about them. It's like, okay, here's your problem. You are only writing down the tagline of what they said in their argument. And while we don't have time to cover this in a lot of depth, you have to remember that a tagline or a claim is not an argument. It's just the start of an argument. To have a complete argument in debate, we have to have, number one, a claim, right, which is the tagline. Number two, some kind of evidence, which we sometimes call warrants, right, some kind of proof that it's true. And then finally, something to explain the impact being why it matters in the debate, okay? So it's very important that we as debaters learn how to prioritize getting those three things, the claim, the warrant, and the impact, onto our sheet of paper so that we have enough information to refute. So let's go back and look at a slightly more developed set of notes or more developed flow on this same resolution. So maybe this is a debater that's been to a couple of tournaments and has a little more experience. And as you can see, what they have, they still have the three major contentions, you know, the abbreviations for what's going on, and that's good. But they also have some information about the sources that were cited, some explanations of what was said, and now they're in a better position to refute exactly what the claims and the evidence are. But let's be very specific about why they're in a better position, okay? Let's not just rush through this. Number one, they have covered the warrants. So as you can see in green, we've circled the warrants here. And again, warrants, if you're brand new, is just a fancy debate word that we use for evidence or proof. It's not always quotes or statistics. It can be logic. It can, in some cases, even be personal experience, but it's just whatever the basis is for the argument. So we have Business Insider here saying they're ranked the number one best value for fries. We have workingmom.com talking about how healthy they are. And if you look at the last of the three contentions, you'll actually see what I've underlined here is I've been to Chick-fil-A and they're always friendly. Now you might say, well, that's not evidence at all. Well, the truth is it is actually a form of evidence. It may not be particularly strong evidence because it's a person's anecdotal example, but it is a form of evidence. And so what I've done here in each of these cases is, I've underlined the source that they're citing or the authority that they're citing. And I actually think that this is very important for new debaters when you're flowing to do something to separate and clarify what the sources are, because sources and evidence are so important in debate. You will find that in most cases, arguments that do not have some kind of support will tend to be disregarded. Your opponents will argue that they should be disregarded. So I think it's really important whether you underline, circle, box in, even highlight sources. I think it's really, really important to know what they are so that you can attack them question them in cross-examination, do what you need to do. But number one, what we're doing here to improve is we are covering the warrants. That's a critical skill in flowing, is making sure the warrant is on the flow. The next thing is we are also noting the impact, right? Why does this argument matter in the debate? Well, the way we express that as debaters is commonly to call it the impact, right? The impact on the world, the impact on the round. So as you can see here in pink, we've circled the impact of the first contention is fries are the common denominator that makes or breaks fast food restaurants. Now that's not like a nuclear war level impact that you'd see in some debates. It's not a, thousands of jobs lost impact, but it is an explanation of why it matters. And for a debate like this, it's probably appropriate. In the last contention, the friendly service makes you want to return. So with that, we see we've got a better set of notes because we have the claims, the warrants, and the impacts. Now, I tend to use a pretty standard format when I teach people how to flow to make sure that we're getting things in the notes and recording them. And that is this example we have right here. So like we said earlier, this is a Lincoln Douglas round. So at the top, it is always very important to flow your preliminary information. So in Lincoln Douglas, that's going to be the value and the criterion, which you can see at the top. And also in any form of debate, you're going to want to make sure you cover any definitions. So whether it's PF, whether it's LD, even policy debaters, definitions are important, right? They need to be on the flow. If there's for example, in PF, if your opponent gives a framework or an observation of what we should be looking at, that needs to go right there at the top because you may very well find yourself disputing that and you have to have a place to put your responses. But as you can see here, when I flow or when I teach people to flow, I use this C1, W, and I, right? CWI. And what that just stands for is the contention or the claim, right? C1 is contention 1, or really just claim 1. But then I also put in a blank, a W for the warrant, and a blank for the impact. And the reason we do this is just to make ourselves conscious and cognizant of the fact that we should be expecting some evidence. And we should be expecting an explanation of the impact, right? And if we don't get them, that's important. And one tip I give people is that it's almost as important, if it may be even more important, to flow the things your opponent didn't say as it is to flow the things that they did say. And so if we were to apply this system, having the contention and then sort of preemptively giving yourself space for what's the warrant going to be, what's the impact going to be, let's apply it to a different debate. Resolved, dogs are better than cats. Now, of course, this is manifestly true. It's not a debatable proposition, obviously. I kid. I know we have cat fans out there. But let's say we're debating this. And look, so we start out, contention 1 says, cats are evil. And then immediately after saying cats are evil, the debater starts talking about how they should be shunned. And nowhere in there did they mention any warrant. Well, if I had just sort of gone through flowing and not noted that, I might forget. I might very well forget in the heat of the debate, as things are going so fast and the information is coming really quickly, I might forget that they didn't have any source or citation or authority. But as you can see here, because I had that little blank there, I went ahead and put the X there. So I'm going to know to come back in my next speech and to explain, Judge, they told you that cats are evil, but they didn't explain any reason or source or authority why that's true. I flagged it for myself so I won't miss it. The second thing I did is, contention 2, there is doggos are heckin' good boys. Well, of course doggos are heckin' good boys. And their warrant is BuzzFeed, March 2017, rated the average doggo 11 out of 10. Great. Why does this matter? Why does this impact the debate? What does it mean that the average doggo is 11 out of 10? What does that even mean? Well, I could have left it at that and tried to hopefully remember to make that point. But by having a space for the impact where I say they didn't explain the impact, they didn't explain what that means, that's going to flag for me later on, right, that they didn't meet their obligation for a complete argument. And then the third contention actually does have a warrant from National Geographic and an impact, which is that cats barely beat out dinosaurs as preferred pets. And that's bad because dinosaurs are violent. So we have a complete argument there. A couple more quick things on flowing individual cases before we move on. Remember that abbreviations and symbols are going to be your friend. For example, you've already seen the equal sign before, and so instead of writing out is or writing out would be or should be, equals is good. But how you do abbreviations is really completely up to you. So you've seen warrant and impact in some of my notes above. I sometimes use a check mark if I agree with my opponent. For example, if they offer a definition that's the same as mine or very similar, sometimes I'll just put a check mark there there. I could write nothing, but the check mark reminds me that I did hear this argument. I did think about it. I'm not just dropping it. I didn't just fail to write it down. I just agree with it. I don't have a problem with it, right? And X, as you've seen before, would be the opponent did not provide this. They didn't provide a source. If there's a dropped argument, which we'll talk about later, sometimes I'll put a big old no symbol there because those are really, really important, as we'll talk about in a minute. And then there are other things about topicality, solvency, inherency, things that you might deal with depending on the kind of debate you do and the kind of circuit that you're in. And really, whatever symbols you want to use, these are just examples of the ones that I might use, but whatever you want to do is good for you. Do, though, try to be somewhat consistent in the symbols and notations that you use, because if you're new to debate, you'll think, well, there's no way I'm going to forget what something meant 10 minutes later from one speech to another in a round. And if you talk to people who've been doing this for a while, they will tell you, oh yes, there absolutely is the ability to do that. In debate, information is going to come at you really fast. It's going to change really quickly. And if you're using 20 different symbols to mean a dropped argument or an impact or whatever, you could very easily confuse yourself. So a little bit of whatever you choose, it's fine, but just do try to be consistent. And so lastly, before we move on, just a few quick tips on flowing individual cases. Just remember to always flow the claim, the warrant, and the impact, or the absence of the warrant or the impact. Don't make the rookie mistake of being the person who just writes down the claim, because a claim without evidence does no good for your opponent in debate, and you want to make sure you note that. Second thing is mark the evidence clearly, circle, underline, box it in, highlight it, whatever you want to do. Just make sure you know what it is, because evidence is super important. And then finally, make sure you mark major omissions. If they didn't have something they needed, mark that, and later on we're going to talk about dropped arguments and how important it is to mark those. So with that, that's a really basic understanding of how to take some good solid notes, some good solid flowing on a single case. Now let's move on and sort of put that into motion across the round from one speech to the next and see how we're going to follow that argument or that set of arguments and refute it across the space of multiple speeches. Okay, so now we're at the part where we actually put the flow into flowing, where we actually start watching the arguments move from speech to speech, from speech to response across the page, and we try to sort of follow them and keep them organized on our sheet of paper. And so to do that, let's jump back into our imaginary Chick-fil-A debate. And let's imagine that we just heard our opponent give the affirmative that we talked about earlier, same points that we talked about earlier. And now what we have done is we have started to sort of outline and flow our own responses here in the second column. So the second column is going to represent our speech, our first rebuttal in response to their speech. Now later on, I'm going to show how you're going to have your prepared case down below, ready to go there. But for right now, let's just focus on responding to the arguments that they have made. So I want you to notice a couple of things on this slide. First of all, you're going to see that the arguments and even the specific parts of the arguments, like the claim and the warrant and the impact, they're all going to get their own sort of separate lanes as we move from left to right across the paper. So for example, look first at this contention about French fries, okay? So you'll notice that there are two responses to this first contention. One is to the evidence, to the warrant, right? And the other is to the impact. So the first one, the response to the evidence, this Business Insider article, well, let's say I've just really done my homework and I've prepared for this debate and I've got a block prepared on this particular piece of evidence, and I say that this Business Insider article only looked at 5 fast food restaurants. It didn't look at huge numbers of fast food restaurants, so it's not a really thorough sample, and that's going to be my response to their evidence. And so I'm going to note that in shorthand there, just BI only looked at 5 FF restaurants. Okay, I know what that means. That's enough for me when I see that and I get up. That's going to trigger my brain to say, okay, here's my argument about why this article is bad. Great, good job. That's really good. The second response we have, though, is on this sort of impact about fries being the common denominator. And I'm just going to say, no, that's not true. You know, French fries are just a side item. They're not that important. You should really be focusing on other things. And so as you can see, each of those two separate points, and they are separate points, right? One is a piece of evidence, and the other is an explanation of the impact. They're each going to get a separate response, and we're going to keep following those. If there's a response to our response, we'll follow it in the next column. And that's how we'll sort of keep track of how that argument is flowing, right? Now, if you look down at the next two contentions, you'll see that sort of the opposite can happen, right? At the first contention, I looked at two different parts and I had two separate responses. You can also go in the other direction and take arguments and sort of group them together and offer a single response to multiple arguments. So as you can see here, what I have decided to do in this debate, and I don't know that this is a particularly good tactic, but this is what this debater decided to do, is I have grouped the second and third contention together, and I have drawn a little arrow. We draw these arrows to keep our arguments connected so that our eyes can follow them, right? We can group them together and offer one response. So on this, what we did was we said, look, contention 2 and contention 3 are about healthiness and service. And our response is going to be that none of that matters. The only thing that matters is how tasty the food is. So what we might literally say in a debate, we would say, for example, okay, in response to their second and third contention, I'd like you to just group them both together. I have one response that applies to both of them. You need to see how you can sort of group arguments together and kind of follow them across the flow like this. And often what we do to show that multiple arguments or multiple parts of an argument are being sort of addressed together is we use these brackets, right? Or we use lines running beside the argument that you'll see in some of the other examples to just show that I'm taking multiple arguments or multiple parts of an argument and I'm putting them all together, group them together, and here is the response, right? So that's another tactic that's frequently used. The last thing that you probably noticed very early on was I've changed colors, right? Now that I'm writing out my own responses, I'm flowing my responses in my second speech here, I'm using a blue pen as opposed to a black pen. Now, you don't have to do this, right? This is not mandatory. Some people say, I don't need to do it. That's fine. The rationale for doing it is this. Debate moves really, really, really fast. And what using a different color does is it allows you on a subconscious, almost reactionary level, right? Just a very quick reaction in your brain to recognize what's going on here, to see instantly when you look at a piece of text, okay, that's not something I was saying, that's something the other side was saying, it's something I should want to refute, it's something I should be in disagreement with. So it just gives you that extra little half second of being able to sort of frame what that piece of text is about. So let's continue, right? Okay, so we gave our speech, right? This is our response on the flow. It's frankly not very thorough, but it's just there to illustrate what a sort of basic set of responses might look like. Okay, so there it is. And our opponent gets back up, and now they're going to offer a rebuttal. So this might be the first affirmative rebuttal in a Lincoln Douglas round. And so as you can see, what we're going to do is we're going to follow their responses over with an arrow. And it looks like they responded to our point about the evidence, and they gave two different responses. So we're going to follow that over, and we're going to put a bracket, and we're going to say we're going to look at their responses and flow them out there. So they said, this is the only evidence in the round. They're the 5 largest fast food chains, so it's a good study. We're going to put that on there and just follow what their response is. And same thing with the grouped response to contentions 2 and 3. And they even, if you see there in the rebuttal, they had their own sort of counter source, the Smith 17 source, whatever that is, and they went ahead and put that in as well. So as you can see, we're following these arguments across. We can bracket them when we're grouping them together for responses. We can put brackets in if they offer multiple responses to us. The idea is to just keep logically moving from left to right, and that is basically how a flow works. So what is this going to look like when you actually sort of walk into a debate round and try to use it? Well, one thing you're probably going to want to do at a tournament is to go ahead and pre-flow your own arguments, right? Pre-flowing just means that you write out your own flow, if you're a Lincoln Douglas, a value, a criterion, definitions, contentions, all that, in the appropriate space on the flow sheet before the round, because, you don't want to have to burn your own prep time if you're, for example, the negative, or delay the round if you're the affirmative. You want to do it really before, everybody has sat down and the judge has signaled that they're ready to go, right? And so as we can see here, this negative debater in this Lincoln Douglas round has gone ahead and pre-flowed their case. One tip I have, if you actually look over in the left-hand column, the first column on the bottom, notice I've put my prep time over here and a little blank for cross-examination questions. I do this because, as you're going to see in a second, this space on a normal flow, whether it's for Lincoln Douglas or PF, this bottom half, right, of the first speech is going to be empty. And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, remember, the first column in the flow is just for the first affirmative speech, or it's for the first constructive speech in a PF round. The negative case is not going to be addressed in that first speech because the negative hasn't gotten up to speak, or the second team in public forum will not have gotten up to speak, which means that this section of the page is going to be blank. And so I'm a big believer in trying to keep as much information as possible in front of me. So I often just use this space, for example, for keeping track of prep time. I might use it to note down some cross-examination questions, and that just lets you keep, more information on the sheet in front of you, not waste space, have less of just sort of having to juggle lots of papers when you're up in front of the judge. But if you do this, when your opponent comes in, you're going to see that you're going to flow their case, and it's going to look like this. So as you can see, you were the negative, they were the affirmative, so you went ahead and flowed them in the top of the first column, right? And now you have theirs, and you had already pre-flowed yours, right? And so now you are well set up. You've got both sets of arguments ready to flow them both across the page and sort of follow them all the way to the last rebuttal and hopefully to victory, right? Now, there are a couple of mistakes that people make in structuring their pages, and let me just go over them really quickly. So rookie mistake number 2 is going to be placing multiple speeches in one column on the flow sheet, right? This is mainly if you use one sheet. If you have, multiple sheets, maybe it's not such a big deal. But as you can see here, that first column is only for the first affirmative speech, right? The first speech. And if you put your own case there, I'm not going to draw it out here for you, but what will end up happening is you will basically sort of have like a checkerboard pattern, like diagonal responses. Like your responses as the negative to the affirmative will be in the next column over, and then their responses to you will be here. It'll be sort of like a checkerboard, and I guess you could do it that way, but for me it gets really confusing, so I just leave this blank, right? The second rookie mistake, and this is a lot more serious, frankly, you really can't do it this way, is placing opposing cases adjacent to one another in the same row. And what I mean is this, right? Remember, the whole point of the flow is to be able to follow those arguments across the page, arrows from one speech to the next, to be able to follow them along, right? If you stick your negative case right next to the affirmative case, you have completely blocked your ability to easily follow his or her arguments across the page, right? Your negative case is not a direct response to the affirmative, unless, maybe you're twins separated at birth and you just happen to think the same. But unless that's the case, this should be blank, right? What we should be doing is this. We should have a flow sheet where we can flow their arguments across, and they will be directly above our negative case, right? And that way we'll have them all in the appropriate column. And, as you go forth throughout the round, it can get pretty complex, and it can end up looking, like this. Now, you may look at this if you're a new debater and say, whoa, 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 that is too much. There is no way I can understand what's going on with all that. Well, let me just say right off the bat, this is sort of an idealized version of what a flow looks like, right? This is a very advanced version. You can see I have the little no symbols for drops. I have tons of brackets. I have arrows. This would be a very experienced debater. Your flow does not have to look like this. It does not have to be as pretty or as advanced as this, because remember, the flow isn't the goal in itself. You don't get awards. You don't break rounds based on your flow. It's a tool. It's a tool to help you be able to summarize arguments effectively. And to show you that, let me just show you this. This is a flow that I had from judging the final round at a tournament last year between two very, very good debaters. One of whom is a debater, I'm not going to mention them here because they haven't given me permission, but you would know their name. They are if you are into the world of Lincoln Douglas, you might have heard their name. Very, very good debater. Against another debater who was somewhat less experienced, but also very talented. Excellent debaters in the finals. And as you can see, this is not nearly as perfect or idealized as this, right? And so, but this is what my flow as a pretty experienced judge looked like. And as you can see, I'm using different colors. I'm following arguments across. Some arguments are getting dropped. In some cases, there are multiple responses. And I'm trying to keep track of it all the way till the very end as the judge. Now, in terms of just tips on what good flowing looks like, a few last minute tips, and they are these. For final rebuttals, I am a big believer of when you get to the final rebuttal, taking a little bit of your prep time and using it to go ahead and take a new sheet of paper and just go ahead and make notes on what that final rebuttal is going to look like. Because I will tell you, no matter how good a debater you are, by the time you get to that last rebuttal, whether it's in PF or LD or any other form of debate, you are going to have a ton of information on that page. Even if you're a really good flower and a really good debater, it's going to be somewhat confusing. And this is why so many last rebuttals in debate are frankly not very persuasive cohesive. They're not very well done. They're a jumble. And so what I tell debaters to do is go ahead, take that flow off, lay it down sideways on the podium in front of you, but also take up with you a simple legal pad with a few key points that you're going to make to the judge. And for me, this always goes the same way. I'm going to do two things for you, judge, in the final rebuttal. First of all, I'm going to spend a little bit of time clearing up the flow and clearing up some outstanding issues that are remaining in terms of the debate, specific issues. And then secondly, I'm going to give the judge some voters that are going to show them voting issues. That's what voters are. I'm going to give them some voting issues, clear, succinct reasons why they can feel comfortable voting for my side in the debate. And I'm going to divide it up just like that. I'm going to do, if I'm the negative, I'm going to spend about the first 2/3 of my speech explaining, these particular issues on the flow, these particular issues in the debate, and why I win them. And then lastly, I'm going to go and give them some clear voting issues on why they can vote for me. This is going to allow me to give a much clearer, better organized, more persuasive final rebuttal to make sure I hit everything, but also to just be a much better speaker while I do it. Because remember, like we said earlier, the flow is not the objective. The flow is a tool to get you to the final rebuttal with all the ideas organized and to put you in a position where you can stand up and give a good, organized, succinct explanation of why you win the debate. And so that's what I really believe in for final rebuttals. That's completely optional. That is not a requirement of flowing. As we said earlier, there are no requirements of flowing. Whatever works for you, works for you. These are just some tips on things to do and things to avoid. And so that is really it. I mean, that is sort of a quick summary of flowing. I guess it could have been a little quicker, but I think just over 30 minutes is a pretty good amount of time to cover it. Remember, by working on flowing and by practicing, you can be more precise and more in control in rounds. Not only can you actually cover the arguments better, but you will feel more in control. You will feel more like you've got these ideas on the tip of your tongue. And that sort of emotional certainty and security, that's actually a big thing in debate. Being able to feel like you know what you're doing is going to get rid of a lot of those jitters and butterflies and let you be much more confident when you stand up and speak. It's going to help you not drop arguments, which is going to mean you don't give away easy losses, right? And it's just going to give you more confidence. So that's going to be about it for this time. If you found the video helpful, maybe like and subscribe. If you think it might be useful to other people, particularly new debaters, let them know about us and our channel. We're going to be coming back with some other videos on debate skills like rebuttals and cross-examination, specific types of argument, theory, whatever we can be helpful with. If there is something you'd like us to cover, maybe drop us a message in the comments or just on our channel. And just remember, debate is for everybody. It's supposed to be fun. So work hard, have fun, hail state, and we will see you next time.